All right, welcome everyone to our April meeting. Almost at the end of the school year. We're going to take some time today to look at our EL data story. And I'm not going to really go in depth on how to do your indicators and things like that this time. We'll do that next time. But just kind of give us a starting view of what we should be looking for as far as our EL data. So that's what we have in store today. Again, welcome to our April meeting. As always, our meeting's going to last about an hour. Sorry, the dog's barking at people on the stairs. We didn't have any questions this month from our note taker, and most of the questions that I received through email and such were about data or testing. So those are kind of what we're going to be covering in our meeting today. And then we'll have a few MEL and WIDA updates. So again, we're going to discuss kind of the access growth targets and reports and how we can use that data today. And as I shared last month, we're going to starting our meetings with these Missouri commitments to English language learners that came from our blueprint. And today's activities are going to be about the shared responsibility for English learner success and effective, well-prepared, culturally responsive educators, high standards, the resources that we need, meaningful and rigorous learning opportunities, and our academic and linguistic support, so which are all part of our data planning. And everything that we do is to support our Show Me Success vision and mission of the state of Missouri to improve lives through education and provide opportunities for all students. So we're going to start out looking at the WIDA and what it has to say about our English learners. We are a WIDA state, one of 40 U.S. states and territories. And WIDA is dedicated to research on the implementation of high quality, culturally linguistic appropriate system for English language learners in K-12 schools. And they're also involved with those in other countries as well. There are a few other outside of the US that are participants in WIDA. They also provide our ELD standards and give us our access assessments and our can-dos. One thing interesting about the new WIDA standards is they're no longer going to be using the MPIs. So if you're part of the facilitated e-learning workshop that we're doing right now, they're going to get into that a little bit at our next time. So we'll have some information to share from that later on. All right. There are 4 domains that we look at through WIDA: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Those are the receptive and productive languages. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then the purpose of access. Why do we give it? It's the annual assessment of English language proficiency for students identified as English learners. Again, 40 states and territories use access to make valid and reliable accountability decisions about their English language learners' proficiency and attainment. And it's used as a starting point for placement and instruction. It's an annual snapshot of your EL performance, and it should be used with other data, both formal and informal, when making decisions about student placement. We give, again, the Access 2.0, or for ELs, and got people in the waiting room just a second. So we're going to continue with the Access for ELs as always, and we've renewed our partnership with WIDA to keep using their standards and assessments. And Access has 6 grade level clusters, K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. And these are anchored to the ELD standards, and they also correspond with our college and career readiness state standards. Moving on. So proficiency and growth are both of the things we look at. So we're going to have a conversation about the current data literacy practices and how you're using your Access today. And we're going to look at, sorry, someone wanting in. Both are important, both at proficiency and growth, and they have their place in their continuous school improvement process. For EL assessment, proficiency and growth have a little bit different meaning than they do for the general content assessment. Proficiency is the current status that the student has in relation to their standards. And while both general content and ELs services strive to attain a certain level of proficiency, the lower proficiency in EL should not have that negative connotation, which is usually what happens with content performance. So if it's a low proficiency in contents, you're not meeting the standard. But learning a language is developmental, as we know. So students are where they are in the process, and their status tells us more about what we as instructors need to do and where the next language targets need to be moved to help them go to the next level. Also, all proficiency levels are present in all grades. So you could have different proficiency levels at different grade levels. So it's not about the cognitive or the content ability, it's about exposure and instruction of language. So EL data literacy focuses heavily on growth, and that's what we're going to look at. If proficiency isn't your only yearly goal, then growth has to be that driver for accountability. So today we're going to talk about describing and interpreting and evaluating ELs from that growth idea. Growth is about progress made between 2 points. It compares a student to himself or your system to itself. And that's what we're going to look at today. And this image has been around for a long time. It's when we're looking at students who are English learners, what a student must be able to do to process and produce is much greater at the higher levels than it is at the lower levels. So what we expect of students who are at proficiency levels of 3, 4, and 5 will often need more time. And it takes them longer to move to the next proficiency level than their peers who are down here in the 1s and 2s. And that's mostly because the demands of the language of content increase as we get to the higher levels. So an example might be scaffolding in science. The language of science sometimes overwhelms our English learners as they're trying to learn that content language at the same time they're learning a language. They might know the concepts, but don't always understand the language of the tests that they're taking or the questions that they're answering. And they need more time to process, and they need those visuals, graphics, and the supports that we can offer them. So when we talk about students' academic language development, we're addressing the language expectations for that ELs need and are as they progress from one language level proficiency to the next. And we know that this progression is complex and a long-term process. So this graphic shows that as a student progresses through the levels of language, the features of language the student needs are produced within 3 categories. They're in the word or phrase level, and the sentence level, and the discourse level. And then we have our 5 levels, our 6 levels, I mean, from entering to proficient. So language acquisition growth varies depending on lots of things, like the proficiency level and the grade level. because of the amount and depth of the content language students are required at the higher levels. And the axiom that WIDA put forth was lower is faster and higher is slower. So at the lower grades or proficiency levels, they grow faster than they do at the higher grades and higher proficiency levels. The growth rates will likely decrease as the student progresses up the grades or proficiency levels. So that's something to keep in mind. And I like the idea that someone shared with me. If you were to pour water into this image, think about how it fills up. If you're at the bottom, it would fill up much faster and you can see the difference. But when you get to the top, it's still filling, but you don't see as much difference as it fills. And it feels much slower because it spreads out more. So this V shape sort of reminds me of filling it with water and how you can see the difference. Okay, so this is why it's essential to provide English learners with differentiated language support within their learning environment so they can succeed academically and linguistically with the adequate rates of growth. What else is running in? Okay. So we also have performance definitions, and this chart provides with some measurable terms and concepts that delineate the features of language, academic language, and the progression of development. It's also broken down into those receptive language that's necessary for comprehending content and concepts through oral and written language, the listening and reading, and the productive language, which is necessary for expressing and demonstrating understanding of content and concepts through oral and written language, thus speaking and writing. So students may have different levels of language proficiency in each of those different domains, depending on the amount of time and quality of opportunities to learn and the practice language that learn and practice their language development. And remember that the level of proficiency in each domain is measured at the discourse level, the sentence level, and the word phrase level. So that's something to keep in mind. And recent research has shown that language mediates learning, or language is the vehicle for learning content. Language proficiency is necessary for students to be able to do whatever is necessary to meet the content standards and their benchmarks. And Missouri's comprehensive assessments only assess content. The access test accesses language proficiency, but it also measures the specialized variations of academic language, which are the language of math, science, social studies, and language arts, and the social and instructional language. So we can use that previous image when we talk about a student's academic language development and how we're addressing the language expectations for English learners when we're talking with our peers and fellow teachers. Excuse me. Lost my play. So again, we can talk to our peers about this, and we can talk about how students' development of language, academic language and academic content are interrelated. We can talk about the students' access to instructional tasks required for complex thinking when it's enhanced by linguistic complexity and instructional support and how they match their proficiency. And again, remind other teachers that slower is faster and higher is slower. The lower grade levels and proficiency levels grow faster than the higher grade levels and higher proficiency levels. And that there are different scales from one year to the next, and they'll likely decrease as the students progress up the proficiency levels. We can share with them that students have different proficiency levels for different domains and in different content areas. We can also share with them that the proficiency levels are dependent on linguistic complexity, the forms and conventions, and the vocabulary used in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So those are all things, conversations to have with our peers. And I thought this was a really good, this comes from our new standards for the 2020. And I really like the way that they've broken things down. And you can see that across the top, it has our proficiency levels from 1 to 6. They represent the stages of second language acquisition. They discuss the discourse, the sentence, and the word phrase levels, from general language to specific academic language. And they highlight the need for that practice in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, all in all content areas. So they've taken and I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at them, but I'm really impressed with our new standards and how they take them and give examples and give you scenarios that you can use to work with the standards themselves. And again, that's something that our facilitated workshop that we're in next week is going to further discuss. So we'll have some things to share out from that later on. All right. And then back to our EL access test. From the access test, we get 3 types of scores. We get the raw scores, which really don't contain any instructionally or diagnostically useful information. It's just used for our data purposes. And then we have the scale scores, and they're used most for accountability by the state. They're generally used for measuring growth, and they're dependent on the context that they're used in. And then we have our English language proficiency score, which connects the scale score to the performance definitions. And this is what the teachers should be using for instructional purposes. And it also helps parents and educators to understand the current level of language acquisition that the students have. Oh, one thing else to remember, we never round up our language proficiency levels. So those, it says here, the second number indicates how far in tenths between the student's scale score, or the student's scale score places them between the higher and lower proficiency level. So those point values are very important. We don't want to round them up. It gives us a better picture of where the student's proficiency lies. All right. So the access test provides us, as I said, scale scores and proficiency levels in each of the different domains, and also a composite score. The basic domain scores are in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then they're combined into that composite, which gives us an oral language, literacy, comprehension, and an overall composite score. And the composite scores are then reported again as scale scores and proficiency levels. And to arrive at those scores, the relevant domains are weighted and added together. The literacy scale score carries greater weight than the oral language because of the emphasis and importance on its success in school. And the weighted, these weightings are used to calculate scores that are shown in this table. Even though reading and writing are more heavily weighted, it doesn't mean that listening and speaking are not as important, because oral language is very important. It's the first to develop naturally in most cases, and they're the bridge to literacy. And ignoring the oral language leads to problems with literacy later on. So there's a word of caution when looking at these breakdown of the composite scores, because composite scores are compensatory. That means that if you get a high score in one domain, it can inflate your total score and make up for a low score in another domain. And a low score in one domain can also bring down the composite score. So you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at composite scores. And that's why we like to look, when we're making decisions, at the individual domain scores. Sorry. This is one of the reports that's generated. There are several reports generated by when you get your access report. sorry, the dog's bothering me. When you get your access reports, each one has an intended purpose and audience. And this is an example of an individual student report. Again, it displays the scale score and proficiency level for each domain, and it produces a short summary of the language level descriptors for each of the primary domains, then listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And this should be kept on file in your students' permanent academic records so that if they should move, that information moves with them. And again, you can see here the way the scores are broken down. We have proficiency levels and scale scores. The scale scores are on the vertical axis, and this means you can measure them over time from year to year and across grade levels. Proficiency levels are reported as whole numbers, again with the decimal, as we spoke a few minutes ago. And I get this question a lot from new people who are new to Access. The proficiency level is not the same as a grade level equivalent. So if you say 4.0, we're not talking about fourth grade. That's just their language proficiency. It's not correlated. All right. The audience for this report is parents and guardians, teachers, and school teams. It's available in multiple languages on the WIDA website. Some of its potential uses are sharing with students to set their learning goals, sharing with parents and guardians to show the progress and attainment, and with teachers who work with the English learners to inform their instruction and assessment. And the next report that we can look at is the student roster report. And this provides a list of students in the district who took the assessment. It gives their scale scores and their proficiency levels in each domain, and also provides that composite score. It also displays the tier of the test that was taken and the grade or grade cluster. So you can see the tiers here, and the grade cluster is there. All right. And the audience for this assessment would be teachers or program coordinators and administration. It's also used to guide instruction and assessment for the program, the ELD program. All right. The difference between scale scores and proficiency levels, the scale scores are dependent on the tier and the grade level. Each form has a range from 100 to 600 points, and the proficiency level scores are interpretive scores. They're an interpretation of the grade level specific and not the grade level cluster scores. For example, in a reading scale score of 303 for a fifth grade student is interpreted as a 2.0. That same 3.3 at a fourth grade is a 2.5. And at a fifth grade level, it's a 2.0. So you can't just say a 3.0, it's not the same across the grade levels. And it's also not the same in the domains. So if you have a 380 in listening at sixth grade, it's a 5.0. That same 380 in reading at sixth grade is a 5.9. So the scale scores are specific to domain and they're specific to grade levels. So you can't make comparisons across the grade levels using the same chart and the same domains. Okay. Yeah, they're specific to their grade level and their domain. So consider these results. If we were looking at a district schools and you had just ordinary elementary school, they had a composite scale score gain of 28.1 points. And the middle school had 20.7 points. And the normal high school had 16.2. So looking at those, if you're not familiar with what kind of growth and the things we've talked about already, when you're looking at these questions, you might not come to the correct conclusion. So the first question says, is the elementary school growing as expected? Well, and if we look, they have a really high score gain. And then looking at the high school, are they below expectation because theirs is only 16? And how do you know what to expect? So all of these things I've mentioned before now give you a better picture of how you can answer that question. Scale scores are dependent on their tier and their grade. And we have to take that into consideration when making decisions such as those. So curriculum drives the instruction drives the classroom assessment drives the curriculum. It's a iterative process. The overall composite score summarizes the student's global language proficiency, and the domain's subscale scores allow for the examination of strengths and contributes to composites. So that's how we use the information. That one's blurry. The next report is the school frequency report. And it represents the number of students and the percentage of total tested students at each proficiency level for each language domain and composite for a single grade within the school. And the audience for this includes program coordinators and administration. It can be shared with the administrators and building staff to inform building level program decisions. The next report is the district frequency report, and it's exactly like the building report, only at the district level. It gives the same percentages and numbers. And the audience for this report are the program coordinators and administrators, as well as your school board might have interest in this. And it's used to inform district level program decisions like staffing and such as that. All right, so I put that in there twice. Let me go past that. So let's look at what is adequate progress and how we use our data. So ensuring that process for reclassification is when we usually start looking at the data, whether they meet the state-defined required criteria, and whether they're ready for reclassification. And we should start this process early in the school year. The students can only be reclassified as a former EL when they've met the minimum criteria that's outlined in our state document, which is a 4.7. There are 4 important components of the reclassification process, and you have to look at both, and you have to plan and attend to each one. The first one is to train your staff. That involves both the EL and the content teachers. They all must be familiar with the rubrics and consider the student performance by examining and collecting evidence throughout the year. So they need to know how to do that. The next is how to identify the students. This is helpful so that teachers don't have to go through and complete those rubrics on every student that's an English learner. A good rule of thumb is to identify students who are at least at the 4.0. I think I normally started with my 3.5 students, but at least 4.0 or higher on the access test. And make sure that your classroom teachers are giving input on those students once you've identified them. But as well, let your ESL staff or ELD staff add into that list any students that they think maybe didn't score high enough, but they think maybe didn't test well, and they might do so in the next year. And so if you have a student that you think is possibly getting close, go ahead and have your teachers start filling out and collecting that data on them. We aren't always going to get it right, but it's better to be prepared. But if you do have someone that scores a 4.7 and you didn't collect that information, you can go back and get some of the information to help support that if you need to early in the next year or as necessary. Also, we need to look at compiling scores and reclassifying our English learners. So we need to compile that list of students and request those rubrics or whatever you use in your district to gather information. And after that's all collected and completed, look at the scoring and how you're going to reclassify your students, change them in their student information system, and anyone that's not received any negative recommendations from the teachers, go ahead and reclassify them for the next year. And then both federal and state regulations require that parents receive certain types of information, and reclassification is one of those. Schools have to communicate this information to parents in a language that they can understand. And that's not just for these reports, but any service or program that we call attention to of parents who are proficient in English. We also need to make sure that our language minority parents understand those as well. And then just this point of clarification at the bottom, because I get this a lot. When we're talking about translation, that is written, and we're talking about interpretation, that is oral. So if you're wanting someone to call and visit with someone, they're interpreting for you. If you're writing it out, some sort of notice to parents, that would be a translation. Okay. So if we reclassify the students, then they go into this monitoring system. Monitoring is ensuring that the students who have been reclassified are not struggling as a result of having lingering language acquisition needs. This is a formal designation, and it actually lasts for 4 years. I know not everyone understands that this is a 4-year process, but we only actively monitor them in year 1 and year 2. So those are the only 2 years that you should be collecting information to determine if they're struggling or not. Years 3 and 4 are more for data purposes, and they're utilized higher up to make sure that your students, how they're comparing to other students as they have reached proficiency. So the state doesn't prescribe the specific process for monitoring, but it must at minimum include a review of students' grades, possibly progress reports or input from staff who work with the student. And it should indicate whether the student is struggling, or if their struggle is caused by language acquisition issues. And you're free to develop whatever form or procedure that you like, but we have some sample forms if you're interested in seeing them. And we have some questions here. Let's see. Scale score gain for schools included on one of the WIDA reports. No, WIDA does not actually compute the scale score gain. That's something we do as for our individual students, and we do it as a report when we're talking about your program and whether you are meeting your criteria. Does WIDA or DESE have a report that shows district growth over multiple years? I actually have a chart that shows Missouri, and I have different charts for different years that you can use for comparison purposes. And Tracy asked, what if the parent is not literate in any language? You can use phone calls, yes. So if you're reporting things out to parents, it's not meant to be something that is difficult for the schools. So if you have a person who can speak in that language and you can elicit their help to help speak to the parents, that's okay. It doesn't have to be written. It can be verbal and presented orally. So that phone call is okay. And the next question says, do we have to collect data for students who score a 4.7? You should already start collecting information for students who are at, who you think will be approaching that 4.7. So generally we start, when I was in the classroom, I started collecting data on my students when they were at a 3.5, just in case they made great gains that year and could possibly score high enough to exit. The recommendation from WIDA and others is a 4.0. So at least at a 4.0, start collecting that data in case the student maybe scores a 4.6 and they score really high in one or two domains, and you want to challenge it and say they really are ready to exit. You have your information and your data already collected and you can use that. So you don't start at a 4.7, but if you had a student who surprises you and scores a 4.7 and you think it's accurate, then you can retroactively go back and collect some information and data on that student. And conversely, if they scored a 4.7 and you think, oh, they're not ready, that was a fluke and they tested really well, again, you can go back and collect that data that shows reading tests and things like that throughout the year, some samples of their work if you held on to them, things that would prove that no, they're really not ready to be exited with a 4.7. So it works both ways. I'm going to share the note taker again. If you haven't signed in, please do so. All right, let me go ahead and move forward now. So we can also, the reason we do the monitoring is so that if that student is struggling academically due to a lingering language acquisition need, then the ELD teacher could meet with staff and the coordinator, the ELD coordinator, to determine if maybe the student might need to be redesignated as an English language learner. That decision can be made at any time during the school year. So if you get back to school the next fall and the student's doing okay the first week, but a few weeks down the road, they're really struggling, you can pull a meeting together and say, hey, this student's struggling. I think maybe we need to pull them back in the program, and that's perfectly all right. You also have to make sure that if you do so, that you document and put that in the student's file, and that you notify their parents of the decision and why you have done so that they're informed. Okay, we talked about the Castañeda's three-pronged test last time, but again, it kind of plays into this as well. And number 3 of the three-pronged test, this demonstrate academic outcomes for ELs, is probably one of the most complex of the 3, because in order to evaluate your program, you have to analyze data about the outcomes for your English learners. And analyzing data from various sources is an important part of many aspects of working with English learners that ELD specialists do. It's essential that you have or that you develop some basic skills in working with data, including English language proficiency data, and that you also have foundational knowledge of how second language acquisition affects the outcomes on non-ELP assessments. And WIDA has some great research from their research arm that's called WCER, that you can look at on their webpage if you're interested in that sort of thing. So as a general rule, when you're evaluating the effectiveness of your English language acquisition program, it's important that you're analyzing student outcomes, not program inputs or activities. And a lot of times when we go out and visit schools, this is one of the things that we're looking at to see if your program is working effectively. So we'll ask you about some of your program goals and what you're doing to improve student outcome. So here's something to consider. A lot of schools have said that they need to collaborate more with their classroom teachers, which is great. And that's true. It's a wonderful thing to do. But consider when you're doing your reporting on this, You might say that our outcome was to have more time, maybe twice a week during a common planning time, to design some supported learning in content classes and boost student learning. It's tempting to say that we plan to collaborate more and then evaluate your program's effectiveness by documenting the number of times that you meet. So the outcome would be the quantity and quality of collaboration. You might have lesson plans and agendas and highlighted discussion points, staff notes and rosters to serve as your evidence. But the problem is those aren't student outcomes. They're good things to gather and good information to have, but they don't really tell how they have benefited the students. So when we're looking at things, we're looking for those student outcomes, not so much what you're doing, but how it affects your students. Okay, so you have to determine some objectives here. The objectives objectives and how you're going to measure them, what instruments you're going to use, the time frame you're going to use for evaluation, the goals for the students, and whether the amount of learning being measured is sufficient. All of this goes into the evaluation of your program, because identifying outcomes is not enough by itself. You have to determine those objectives and how you measure them. You have to ask, how often am I going to do this? Am I going to look at the learning quarterly, biannually, annually? And what are the goals? Is the amount of learning, like I said, enough compared to what? Has it improved over time? So again, all of that goes into the evaluation. And then we look at achievement versus growth. Again, you have to recognize the difference between achievement and growth, and what each can be used for and which one fits your purpose. Achievement gives us a snapshot in time, and growth is a measure of change over time. Achievement points are often tied to variables that are outside your program. For example, whether they had former schooling, their proficiency level. Growth measures are independent of all of those variables. So we're just looking at that student and how they progress from one point to another. So we're going to look at a few questions here to see if you can tell the difference between an achievement question about achievement or a question about growth. So here's the first one, and I'll stop talking and let you put some answers in the chat, whether you think it's an achievement or a growth. If I ask what percentage of our students meet the standard in math for grade 8, would that be an achievement or a growth? Good job, you guys are right. It is achievement. This is asking about meeting a standard or criterion. It's not asking about progress or change over time. It's just getting at snapshot. Okay, here's another one. Achievement or growth. How much progress on average are our students making toward achievement of the standards for math in grade 8? Would that be achievement or growth? Yeah, you guys got it. You're right. It's asking about over time. Anytime you see the word average, you're taking more than 1 point and putting them together to get a score. So again, when it says average, it indicates a measure of growth over time rather than just one specific point. Okay, how about this one? Achievement or growth? Do our students need interventions in math? What do you think? Would that be achievement or growth? Some disagreement here. Okay, this one can be an achievement measure, since in order to determine which students may need an intervention, you'd have to know which students are not meeting a criterion at a certain point of time. But it's kind of tricky. Yes, it could be both, because if all of your students are not meeting a criterion at a certain time, does this mean that they all need an intervention? Or does it indicate that something about the program needs to change? So achievement data alone might not be enough to answer this question and not give you enough information. And there's actually really no concrete or correct answer to this one. You should take into consideration several factors when you're making those kinds of decisions. So good job, guys. Here's another one. How effective is our program for EL achievement of the math standards in grade 10? So would that be achievement or growth? Good answers. Now this one's also kind of tricky because for English language learners, language affects the outcome on content assessments. So if the assessment is properly modified and is valid, then it could be an achievement measure because it'll tell you how or which and how many students achieved a standard as a result of the instrument they received. But if it's not entirely valid because it doesn't eliminate the effects of language proficiency, then a growth measure is going to be necessary to determine if the program is producing effectiveness because, you know, it has to be valid and it has to meet the students' needed. So you might need a combination of achievement and growth to make this decision and get the most comprehensive picture. All right, I think there's one more, or two more. Which students are not benefiting from interventions that we've implemented? So would that be achievement or growth question? This one is clearly a growth measure since it's asking about change over time, the time of the intervention. So when the intervention started and when the intervention ended, you're looking to see if they've made growth over time. Very good. All right. The last one. What does the student body profile for my school look like in terms of English language proficiency? In other words, what is the breakdown of English language proficiency levels by grade or by school? Would that be achievement or growth? Yeah, you're exactly right. It is achievement because it's asking for a measure, a snapshot of information about the students. Very good. All right. So this just goes to tell you that we need data-informed decision-making when we're looking at our students. We want to look at the growth evaluation, how well the students perform at each proficiency level compared to other students in Missouri, which proficiency levels are meeting the expectations and which aren't, and then looking at your program. How well are all teachers trained to work with their English learners, and what's the role of your specialists? This gets to that question that was asked earlier. DESE provides a report to districts each year, not this year because we don't have the data, but most years. And it provides growth information based on your access results for the district. It's going to contain your growth history in a 3-year cycle, a current year's target, the growth they made most recently, and whether or not they achieved their current target. It also gives a percentage of the target that's attained. And we use that to determine whether you are targeted or a comprehensible school for improvement. And these reports are used to evaluate district growth. And this is going to be discussed later. So we'll come back to this information and talk to you a little bit more about how we're going to do that. There are some things right now that are not going to be the same. We're still in discussion about how we're going to handle with COVID, the fact that we didn't do our MAP testing. So there's a little bit of information to come on that. There's still a lot of discussion going on. Those reports are sent to your coordinator. Sometimes they're sent to your superintendent of schools. So you would need to ask someone at the central office level who receives them. And a lot of times they're sent to your superintendent first. So you'd have to ask at your district office. But I always, when I was the coordinator for the district that I worked in, I always went and asked for them, and they were happy to share them with me. It's good information for you to see. And you can always email us. It's a, you would ask, and I can't think of it. We'll get to that in a second. I'll tell you what it's called. I think it's further on in the presentation here. It just escaped me. Yeah, there you go, progress indicator. That's what you're looking for. So yes, ask your central office for EL progress indicator. All right, so we use the indicator to determine the effectiveness of your educational program for English learners. And actually, it should be happening in every class all day long. It also helps you with the district's language instruction educational program, or the LIEP. We look at pull-out, co-teaching, however, whatever program you say that you're using, and the level of collaboration that your content teachers and your specialists have with each other. This also helps with goal setting, as we talked about previously. It motivates educators to make exiting the EL program a reality for their students, so it gives you a pathway to follow. It helps educators think about the path and the tools needed for the students to exit, and it also increases student agency and engagement when they have those indicators or goals to work towards. And we always go back to the federal definition of what is an English language learner. And so when these things down here in red, when those are no longer a problem, then we know that our students are ready to be successful in the classroom. So they need to have that ability to achieve in the classroom where language of instruction is English, or the opportunity to participate fully in society. That's our goal. So that's what we're working towards. This is just a chart that again comes from the researchers on the research arm of WIDA, the WCER. They created these charts based on millions of student records that they looked at over time. And they came up with this maxim that says lower is faster and higher is slower. And they found that on average, as we said earlier, that students at the lower proficiency levels make greater gains than the students at the higher levels. So looking at this graph, we have on the y-axis the average gains from scale score from one year to the next, and the x-axis is the proficiency level, the initial proficiency level of the students. So let's see, if they started in first grade of the the proficiency level, if they started in the first of the 2 years that it's used to measure growth, the colored lines, the blue is the 25th percentile, the red is the 40th percentile, and so on. And as you can see from looking at the lower proficiency levels, they made a lot more gains than those at the higher levels. And this is true for every grade. So if you looked at the chart for 6-8, or this one is for 6-8, if we looked at the one for 9-12, you would see smaller. The gains are still about, the levels are about the same, but the change is smaller because of where they started. We kind of talked about this, composite scales. The big question that we ask is the student making adequate progress with sufficient supports in place? So when we're looking at our students, we want to make sure, I've been getting a lot of questions about whether they should put their students in special ed services, or whether the student is having, the problems they're having are related to ability or proficiency. So you need to look at these scale scores and see if there is a big change from year to year. So in this one, they had 355 to 6.1. that's only 6 points of scale score growth. So that one, they're both at a same proficiency level. I think it's I don't remember what level it was, a 3.5 or something like that. But the numbers are not, so it's the same 3.5, but the scale score points show you whether they've had growth or not. So there might be growth in scale score points when there's not growth in proficiency level, is what I was trying to say. There are charts that kind of give you an idea from proficiency level to proficiency level what the cut score is. I found one for 4.8 and I've requested one for 4.7, but I haven't received it yet. But this will give you a good idea of what proficiency level cut score, scale score cut score that you need to be at a 4.7 or close to a 4.7. And then a few years ago, these charts were released, and thank you to Tracy Rutherford for sharing these with me. But they give you the average proficiency level growth over time, and these can be used to plot your information. And we'll talk more about this next month. But student targets, one way that you can use this information. So pick your baseline. If they are at a level 1 when they start, we generally say it takes 6 years to reach proficiency. And that's what our charts have all been normed for, was a 6-year period. So if they start at level 1, that means they have 5 more years to reach their proficiency of 4.7. If they start at 2, that means they have 4 years. At 3, they need 3 years. At 4, they need 2 years. So you take their targeted scale score and subtract their current or previous access score and divide it by the number of years that are remaining for proficiency. And here's an example of this. So if they started their baseline year at a 2.0, and your goal is 4.7, you're going to take 4.7, subtract your 2.0, and divide by those 4 years that are needed to reach proficiency. And that gives you 6.8, which rounds to a 7. You add the 2.0 plus the 7, and that equals of 2.7. And then when your test comes for the next year, you compare that to your goal. The 2.7 was the goal. They scored a 2.8, so they exceeded the goal. And you do that for each year. And as you go on, you divide it by the number of years that are left. So the next one would be 4.7 minus this 2.8, divide by 3 years that are left. You get a 6.3, so that rounds to 6.0. Add 2.8 plus your 6.0. Their goal would be a 3.4. The next year, you look at their test. They scored a 3.4, so they met. And proceeding on, you take the 3.4, subtract it from your 4.7 goal, divide it by the 2 years that are left. You would get 6.5, which rounds to 7. Because they didn't make as large of a gain, that goal is going to increase a little bit. So 3.2 from the, whoops, I didn't get that right. 3.4 should be plus the 7. That would be 12, 4.2, and then moving forward. I made an addition problem. Then you can take those points and plot them. So the blue would be the actual growth, the red would be your targeted growth. And you can see that as they've gotten higher, they didn't quite meet their goal. And then you can do the same thing with scale scores. This one is set by a 5.5, and the goal is 399 for 5.0. Same problem to solve. 3.9 minus 255 which was their starting score, divided by 4 years gives you an increased growth target of 36. And if they scored 295 the next year, is a change of 40 points positive. So they exceeded. And this is the same scores from the previous one. This is just showing you could do it with skill scores as well as with proficiency levels. I think the scale score is much more accurate and close, but it comes up with the same results. So you have your baseline, they exceeded, they didn't meet, and they didn't meet. So this student would not be eligible for exit and would require an additional year. And again, you can plot that as well so that you see, and it has the same sort of information, just looks a little bit different. And then I have charts like this for Missouri for each proficiency level. If you'd like to have those, let me know. A few people have said they can't access them from the WIDA portal, but I do have access to those if you're interested in them. So this is the most current. This is from 2021, based on the 1920 scores. So we have that available. So I took the students' starting proficiency, and you can see that they are on target with Missouri. So they're about where everyone else in Missouri is. So growth chart proficiency levels. Other things to note that we have a little bit of issue when they get to the upper grades, the high school grades. So if they start with a low proficiency in, say, 11th grade, they only have 2 years to make progress. So when you're making your target, you'll still have to use that targeted proficiency for 12th grade. So you can't extend it on beyond. So that student is not very likely going to make their target. Students who don't reach proficiency by their targeted year have insufficient growth, so they're going to have to stay in the program unless it's their baseline year, and then they would be exited. A student at 4.7 always means the student counts as meeting growth unless it was their first year of access testing. And if a student doesn't test a year, it'll result in counting as not meeting the growth at least 1 year. So like if your students didn't take the test last year, then they count as not making growth, and they'll have to continue in the program until they take the next test. How you serve them, it may not be the same. You could serve them, not see them as often, but they still have to remain in the program and on your books until they take that assessment. So that's something to take note for this year. We are getting really close to time, so I'm going to skip over this case study and look at it next time. You can look at it if you like on your own. The implications for this are meeting the needs of our students for pull-out, push-in, co-teaching, ESL classes, sheltered classrooms, resource rooms, helping you make those decisions on where the student should be placed in the program. Also what needs the student has. So if they are test really well in listening and speaking, then you would focus your time on reading and writing. If they struggle with things related to math, you could talk about listening, speaking, reading, and writing as it pertains to math. So getting to know your students and their needs is what's really important here, making those student profiles. And as always, you can talk to your MEL instructional specialist, and they can help you work through some of this data and get the information you need. And talking about our MEL personnel, Rob in St. Louis area has some upcoming events. He's going to be having a book study, and you can register through this link. He's also going to do, or I'm going to help him we're going to work together to do another access growth presentation, and you can register for that there. And then WIDA has some new offerings that I wanted to make you aware of. One on interpreting access scores. It costs $100 for these, and they are, I think it's a 2-hour, yes, a 2-hour session. But they have a couple of times that you can register. They have this new program, School Improvement Systems, that they're advertising. It says What We Do, WIDA, and you can read more about that there. And then there are a couple of other webinars and programs that they have coming up. There is a WIDA screener question and answer webinar that you can attend if you still have questions about the screener that you would like to ask. And then they have a new newsletter, WIDA Espanol News, that is available, and you can find out about that through this link. All right, I threw a lot of stuff at you today. If you have questions, you can put them on the note taker. I have invited Tracy Rutherford from down and near Cape Girardeau to visit with us next month, and she's going to share some data mining that she does in her area that was excellent, and it will give you a better picture of how to take the information that you have and utilize it in your schools. And she's going to share some graphs and some ways of determining growth for your district. And she's already made a comment here. It says you can use the data to see which content teachers are helping students have the most growth. That's very true, Tracy. So please come join us next month. Tracy's going to walk us through how she utilizes data and creates some charts and gathers information for her students. And it will be very helpful. And I'll also talk a little bit about the progress indicators that DESE uses. And hopefully by then I'll have some updates on the information that we can provide you where we're going with the new direction. And I am going to stop talking and let you ask any other questions that you might have at this time. Oh, I do have one other point of interest. Merica Klinkenbeard, who is the Southwest representative at MEL, is leaving us, and she's taken a position with Springfield Schools as their head of English language development. And we will very much miss her, and I'm sure she'll still be involved with our ELD meetings quite a bit, but she will no longer be our MEL person. That person will be replaced, and we will sorely miss Merica, and it'd be hard to fill her shoes. She's been a great asset to us. So we want to bid her farewell and wish her best at Springfield Schools. So if that's all I have, if you have any questions, please unmute or put it in chat. And you can always add questions to our note taker, and I will read those as the month goes on. Thank you very much for being here.